All right, so we'll go ahead and get started since looks like we've got the time has hit 2 o'clock, and as I've always said before, I try to keep you in and out under an hour. So we're going to go ahead and continue, hopefully, with that particular issue. Today we're going to talk a little bit about impression management and interviewing communication. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Dr. Mike Searcy. I am a communication professor here at Somerset Community College. I teach a couple of days a week, both here at the main campus and a couple of days a week at the McCreary Center, at our McCreary Center down south. And then I also get the opportunity to teach as well on our internet program and online as well. When we're talking about interviewing, and we're talking primarily about impression management and the communication of that management, one of the things we need to pay attention to is communicating our best image. On our workbook here, if you look at page 2, for instance, I got a couple of quotes here that I want to cover just to put us in the right mindset of what we're talking about. The first is from the Dalai Lama. Sometimes one creates a dynamic impression by saying something, and sometimes one creates as significant an impression by remaining silent. We got to be wary sometimes when we're having any sort of communication of saying the wrong things or saying too much just because it occurs to us in our minds doesn't necessarily mean that we ought to be mentioning it openly. It's better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. Now, many of us have heard that before. What you may not know is that that's been attributed variously to Abraham Lincoln, the journalist Sylvan Engel, or Mark Twain. And then on occasion, it's actually been attributed to Sylvan Engel quoting Abraham Lincoln. So we're not entirely sure where the origin of that one is. Even a fool, when he holdeth his peace, is counted wise, and he that shutteth his lips is esteemed a man of understanding. So even some of what we're talking about with respect to knowing when to open up and when to shut up might even be traced back to the Bible. The art of impression formation then may be to determine when and what to say, or even more importantly sometimes, when to remain silent. And sometimes we can just say too much, and we know that. And we actually... it's not my stomach really, it's the microphone cord making all kinds of interesting noises here. Okay, in fact, we're going to do this. Okay, so when we're looking at impression formation, when do we actually open up and when do we remain silent? And you know, sometimes we have to recognize where we are in a relationship with anybody. And when we talk about interpersonal communication and we talk about interpersonal relations, we talk about actually getting involved with anybody. That takes time, and you don't necessarily reveal everything that you know about yourself to somebody on the first time you meet. I don't care if that's an interview or if that's the grocery line at the Walmart when you're trying to go to the checkout. How many times have you been caught somewhere where somebody's going to look at your grocery cart, and the next thing you know, they want to strike up a conversation? Nothing wrong with that until they start telling you about all their surgeries, their divorces, and all the personal things that happen in their life, and you're just thinking, wait a minute, far, far too much. And although they may be a very quality candidate for a job, that's not the interview is certainly not the place for that either. Ever. Okay. So page 3. How do we phrase things? What do we say? Look at that cartoon. I've thought a couple things in here, hopefully to lighten up what we're talking about as we go. When one woman says to the other, it kind of creeped me out, but his friends say that he brings a dozen roses to all his first dates. Should I be worried? And then she points out the obvious here, right? And what was said. About the roses, no. About the phrase, all his first dates, yes. People have a tendency, based on everything you say and how you phrase it, to start trying to interpret, what do they mean by that? What's all the... And it may have been an innocent comment. But we've got to watch innocent comments. All right, so we're going to talk today a little bit about the interview. and talk a little bit about how during an interview we're going to look at actually impression formation and creating a positive communication climate. And what kinds of things do we need to think about in our own phraseology with respect to how to phrase things in an interview? First off, a couple of things to note. There are a couple of different kinds of interviews. The first being an information interview, at least the kinds of interviews that concern us for today's session. The purpose of this interview, middle of page 3, the purpose of this interview is to ask for advice and further knowledge of the career field. You often build contact and network lists that may be helpful to you in the future. As is often said, remember, of course, that if you're not networking, you're more likely not working. Networking is a very important thing to do. Creating contacts, getting involved with people so that you understand who they are. You know, Harvey McKay used to say, dig your well before you're thirsty. This semester I'm trying what I'm calling a beta program with all of my interpersonal communication students. This semester, for the first time, I'm having every one of my students get on LinkedIn, which is a professionals contact database, much like Facebook, except it's actually career-oriented and professional contact lists rather than just being friends with people and creating those kinds of things. All right, back to what we were talking about with respect to networking. As I said, all my communication students in interpersonal communication this semester are now getting ready to work on LinkedIn, which is specifically geared toward training them with all the exercises that we're going to do, training them to think beyond their geography. I used to teach at the University of Hawaii on Maui, and one of the interesting, fascinating things about Maui is that it's Maui. And if you know anything about Maui, it's a beautiful paradise island. However, it's very expensive to live there. And a lot of people who are there aren't making any more than minimum wage. And for some of us, that sounds familiar. And they are very much trapped by their geography, because when we start looking at the island of Maui, they can't just commute to Oahu, where Honolulu is on a regular basis, weekly or daily, in order to get a job. They've got to do something right here on this island. And one of the things that's interesting about working with students like that is they are very geographically constrained. So thinking beyond their geography, how am I actually able to branch out, network, get to know people, get to have interpersonal interactions, sometimes at this point online, so that they can start doing so. So one of the things we need to start thinking about in terms of if you have a job now, but you're thinking maybe, or not even thinking maybe, you should always be thinking, who are the people in my industry? And who are the people that are in the industry I'd like to be in? And start thinking in terms of, as we just talked about on page 3, thinking in terms of the information interview. Get to know people in the industry. Find out what they do, how they do it, how they got there, how they got started, where they hope to go from here. You know, we have to laugh because I have a trick I'll share with you, especially if you happen to find out, get to know any of the people in the college here who have PhDs. There is only one topic that every PhD, especially at the time that they were working on their PhD, is mostly and intensely interested in, and it is the one topic that nobody else cares about: their dissertation and research. You want to get a PhD talk and ask them about their research. And be interested. Okay, we move on. Employment interview is number 2. And I threw in another cartoon here so that we can certainly lighten the mood a little bit. As one guy says to the woman at the bar, "Oh, I'm unemployed." But it's not as exciting as it sounds. What is the employment interview, and what do those employment interviews look like? Look at page 4. First is the screening interview. You've done your work, especially those of you who may have gone to the previous workshops in this series. You've done your work up to this point, and you've created a resume. You've created a cover letter. You've created some of the advertising documentation created to market you. You got that stuff out, and then the next thing that happens at this point is a screening interview. It's a telephone or email, or I've actually had a number of these. I've conducted a number of these, as well as been part of a number of these from the candidate side on Skype now. The internet is nothing to be afraid of. In fact, if you're not ready to embrace it, you're probably miles and miles behind the next person. This can last anywhere from 10 minutes to 30 minutes usually. It's very cost effective for the employer. It's crucial to have all the documents available in front of you for this interview. Your resume, your job description of what the job was that you were applying for, any notes you've already got about the company, a list of references, possible prepared notes for typical interview answers with the crucial information you want to get across. Treat it like an open book exam. Yes, even if you're on Skype, you can manipulate Skype, can't you? We have a webcam. You can set that webcam, and we all do this, don't we? If we're going to talk on the phone with Grandma on Skype, we're going to set it up against the wall, so it's looking against the wall in our house that is the cleanest wall in the house, right? And everything in the background, you don't want piles of dirty laundry back there, do you? Everything in the background is going to look sharp, it's going to look clean, but you can also do this with having a table, for example, right? For example, at this level, if I'm standing for the interview, it doesn't say you have to sit. Okay, I can stand for the interview. The camera can be from here to here. And I can have all my notes right here in front of me on a table. So I might look as if I'm kind of thinking about something for a moment. What am I really doing? I'm scanning a page for something out of that page that I want an answer for. Treat it like an open book exam. You wind up with a screening interview. Make sure you have all your notes out in front of you. It's amazing. This is the first time I'm ever going to say this, and probably the only time you'll ever hear anybody say this. If the phone rings and you're in the middle of applying for a job, what are you going to do first off? You're going to get on those cell phones. If you're giving your cell phones out, you're going to make sure that the outgoing voicemail message is a professional one, right? You're not going to have, some bebop, leave a message at the tone kind of things going on, right? You're going to have something that sounds very, very professional. If you're applying for a job, know what area codes you're applying to. You have caller ID. And when you see, if you're in the middle of job applications, my suggestion to you is first and foremost, and this is going to surprise you, don't answer that phone. Don't answer the phone. Why? Especially if you're doing something like driving a car, especially if you're doing something where you're otherwise distracted. If you're not able to give whoever's on the other end of that phone your full, undivided attention with pencil in hand, don't answer that phone. People expect people to be busy occasionally. They don't expect that you're sitting on the phone staring at it, waiting for their call. What happens now when they call, you answer the phone and they say, great, we're from ABC Company and we want to actually interview you and talk to you a little bit about this job. Are you still interested? You say yes. And you start talking about your experience. Then you forgot you applied for 3 jobs at that same company and that you're not talking about the same job. Problem. Because you've essentially told them, yeah, you're interested, but just not the job they are offering, that they're talking about. Don't answer the phone, because what are they going to do? They're going to leave you some very vital information on your voicemail. They're going to leave you the name of the caller. You can go look that up often online and make sure you've got the proper spelling right up front and that you can find out exactly who's calling you. Is it the person who runs the company, which is usually the administrative assistant? Or is it the president who does what the administrative assistant tells him to do, right? Or is it the person, who's got a particular title, very specific? And you kind of want to know that when you call them back. Because it makes you look really, really prepared. They're also going to leave you the telephone number. The last thing you want to do is, have talk to them. You don't have their telephone number, or they call from a different number, and that number doesn't actually ring through, or whatever the case might be, doesn't go to the switchboard, etc., etc. You'd like to have that number. They're going to leave you the telephone number. And they're also going to leave you, obviously, what position in particular are they calling about? You apply for this job, whatever it is. They think they're just catching you up on why they're calling. What they're really doing, if you've got 1 million applications out, what they're really doing is helping you hunt it down. Which one is this again? You can go back online, if you haven't kept a file, you can go back online and pull it up, print it off, put it right there in front of you, make sure that you're actually referring to the actual job description that they're talking about when you do talk to them again. Don't answer a screening interview. If you're in the middle of a series of job applications and looking for a job, don't answer the first call. So, my advice to you, unless you recognize with 100% certainty the caller ID, let it go to voicemail, but have a very good outgoing message. Okay, once one gets through the screening interview, we're talking about the candidate interview. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me go back for just a quick moment. The last thing, when we talk about screening interviews, make sure when you call them back that you don't have a frog in your throat. The last thing you need to be doing is talking like this when you're right? Make sure that you're in top form. Get in top form. Drink a cup of coffee. Get energy into your system so that when you call them back, you can sound excited. Because if you don't sound excited, you're calling them back. You're calling them back on your time. They understand you had time to prepare, in essence, by the time you're calling them back. So what's happening if you call back and go, hello? Yeah, this is him. Yeah, I might be interested. They can't see you. So all the nonverbal communication has to come from your voice. You know, that there's a saying that smiles can be heard. They better hear a smile. They better hear that excitement. Or they're only going through the motions and you're not going to get called back. Okay. Candidate interview. This is often done with an individual. Could be the current supervisor, the boss, the owner of the company. A succession of individuals. You're going to meet this one first, then you're going to meet that one, and then you're going to meet this one, and then you're going to meet this one. And then afterwards, they're going to send you all home. They're going to get together. They're going to talk about you. And then they're going to decide. Or it might be a committee. If this is with an individual, find out the anticipated length of time. This interview usually lasts between 30 and 90 minutes. The closer you are to the 30-minute anticipated limit, now think about this for a moment. There's a science, a practiced science to interview answers. And it doesn't entail the rambling of misaligned thoughts in your head. There's a science to how you prepare your answers. If you know that this is going to be a 30-minute response, also know that there's going to be about 10, 15, 18 questions in any interview. And almost always they will prepare ahead of time. If you know it's going to be an hour or 90 minutes or about 2 hours, ask the question if they don't tell you. How long is this going to be? Because what's going to happen is you're going to get a lot of standard questions. I'm going to give those standard questions to you here before we're finished. You're going to get a lot of the standard questions. But your answers need to be practiced to be concise if it's only going to be a half-hour interview, right? But you can elaborate much more. You don't start elaborating on the first so many questions so they can't get to the whole set of questions. Because oftentimes they have a whole set of questions there on purpose. Depending upon the organization's policy, they have to ask you those questions. And if you waste their time, yes, you're there to interview for a position. But remember, you're interviewing each other. So their time can be wasted just as much as yours. And if you're going to elongate answers and you can talk for 30 minutes about the first question, they're not that interested in pursuing the rest of the questions. Okay. So the more concise your responses need to be, the shorter the interview time. Practice short responses that contain everything you want to communicate. If longer, you have the opportunity to respond with specific examples of how you can contribute to the organization for which you wish to work. If the interview is with a committee, remember to look at everyone on the committee, not just the single person asking the question. Because it's amazing, sometimes the question is going to be asked, if there's a committee of people, the question is going to be asked by the person who might be most involved in that issue, but the decision is going to be made by everybody around that table. So make sure you're actually giving some eye contact to everybody around the table and smile. Practice that if you need to. Yes, practice smiling if you need to. Okay. That second interview can sometimes last a half a day or a full day, especially if you're meeting with 3 to 5 individuals, depending upon the kind of job and what kind of position and organization you're in. This may include a representative from Human Resources, the department head, office staff, the department head supervisor. Be alert and enthusiastic at all times. The more you know about the structure of the process, the less anxious you're going to feel and the better you're going to perform, right? The more you know. How many times have we said, if I only knew this ahead of time? You have a lot of opportunities to find things out ahead of time. If you've done your networking in advance, you can even call these people and say, hey, what are interviews like over there? Who do I really need to talk to? How important is this person or that person? Okay, a word about interview styles. Dr. Mike's tip number 1, page 4. You are not just being interviewed. You are indeed interviewing the company to determine if this is where you want to spend a large part of your time during the day. So interview wisely. Remember, you are also interviewing the company. How many times have you taken a job only because it was offered? And I hate to say it, but a lot of us have. Only because it was offered, only to find out it was a very large mistake, and 3 or 4, 6 weeks into it, we're thinking, oh dear God, if I had only known what I was getting into, there's no way I would have taken this. And yet we often say to ourselves, oh boy, I really needed that job. And so I went ahead and I took this job. And then I went there and I thought, no, I didn't need it that badly. You're interviewing the company just as well as you are being interviewed by the company. Okay, next type of interview. The behavior, when we talk about candidate interviews, let's talk about the various types. First one we're going to talk about, the behavioral-based interview. Bottom of page 4. Critical behavioral interviewing, CBI. It's based on the idea that past performance is a very critical indicator of future performance. These are questions you ought to be looking at in advance and practicing answers. CBI will often use more probing questions than what may appear to be standard interviews, and what may appear to be in standard interviews. I'm sorry, a little tongue-tied today. You should prepare by thinking of very specific examples that you can cite relative to your core performance and job functions, such as the following. Teamwork. What's a question look like here? So tell me about a time in your past when you were showing excellent teamwork skills. Tell me about the project and how did it turn out? And even now, some of you, when you heard that question, kind of went, These are questions you can prepare in advance and think about them now, before you ever get to the interview. Conflict management. Have you ever had to deal with a difficult coworker? What did you do and how did it work out? And if you can't come up with a real positive response to these questions, people are going to suggest you haven't got a clue what you're really talking about. Communication, creativity, flexibility, organization, dealing with difficult coworkers, dealing with superiors, etc. Okay. Other types of interviews for that candidate interview. Skill testing, or the task-oriented interview. This interview will include tasks or tests to prove knowledge either necessary for the job or claimed on your resume. It's amazing how many times people say they can do something on their resume and are never challenged. You know what? Some of the new ways people are paying attention in organizations today are actually challenging you to actually show us you can do what you're claiming you say you can do on the resume. Be very careful. Communication skills may be evaluated, for example, if you are asked to give a presentation. Typing may be analyzed through computer typing tests, etc. Sometimes they give people who are going to be doing math or research these kinds of tests. You know, the other thing, though, you need to actually consider, though, and be careful about this, is some companies, and this does not happen often, but it can, be prepared that if you really want the job, you're going to work for it, sometimes work for it in advance. Because oftentimes what happens is if you want to go for a marketing job, you want to go for an advertising job, or you want to go for a welding job, they may actually have you come in and work on an active project. This is something we're working on welding right now. Here, I want you to do this well. And you walk away thinking, wait a minute, you just got free labor out of me. Yeah, that's part of the game. You know, we just have to kind of take that as it goes. The other one, and the one I'm going to even caution you more on, is the gauntlet, or the stress-induced interview. The interview will include the interviewer antagonizing you, just to see how you respond. They may interrupt you, bait you, appear to be insensitive, include awkward silences, and even ask inappropriate questions. They ask these questions on purpose, not just due to their ignorance of the law. Just to see how you act under pressure. I've worked for a number of companies, and one of the time, way back when I was working on my PhD in the late 90s, I was at the University of Iowa, and I was asked a number of times to be on the committee to help interview and find new professors we were going to hire at the University of Iowa in the communication department. The communication department. One of the preeminent communication departments with a reputation as being just pristine around the world. University of Iowa, go figure. And yet, when we brought these people in, some of the giants in the industry, professors that I highly, highly admire, would sit at the table, look at the person's research, and start digging and digging and digging, and just pounding the candidate with questions about theory and research and things they should have learned 15 years ago. And just really just pressing and pressing. And as I'm watching this, one of the things I kept thinking about and saying to myself, never, ever, ever would I take a job at this school. And I think one of the things that really taught me was, when you go for a job interview, remember, of course, if you're interviewing them as well as them interviewing you, because, granted, it always surprised and shocked the heck out of me when any one of those professors who'd just gotten beaten up accepted the position. Because they did this to everybody, as if it was some sort of test, some sort of gauntlet. But then ultimately, when they actually brought the faculty in, they didn't treat them any better. So the test didn't get any better. Dr. Mike's tip number 2. Because you are interviewing the company at the same time they are interviewing you, you have to ask yourself very pertinent questions such as these. If they treat me this way during the interview, how may I expect to be realistically treated on the job? And if this is the way management responds to me during the courting process, what will the continued communication climate be like? They can't look at it, you can't look at it, as the attainment of the success is getting the job. Because, quite frankly, getting the job is sometimes a lot easier than keeping the job and being happy. And there's a big difference there. We can all get a particular job. The question is, do we want to keep it? That's where our careful interviewing goes. Okay, the employment interview. Of course, we know on page 6, of course we know that before the interview we must do some preparation. Evaluate the job description, evaluate your skills. You don't really want to end up like this fine gentleman in this cartoon who we assume works in a morgue. And he says, because we assume that the reporter asked him, so why are you in this job? And his response is, because I enjoy working with people. I suppose as long as they don't talk back. So what are we doing before? Prepare documents, marketing and sales brochures, preparing a resume. I'm not going to go into this at length, just kind of a couple of comments here. First off, you should have your identification on a resume. Some people are putting a career objective on a resume. Either way is usually okay at this point. Your education ought to be on your resume as well. Your experience. Sometimes people are putting references. That's more of an optional thing at this point. Special skills and interests, especially if there are things like you speak a second, third, or fourth language. Activities, honors, and awards. What's the purpose of a resume?
It's your introduction to that company.
Your introduction to the company?
To sell yourself.
To sell yourself? Okay. Remember, of course, what you're doing is you're giving them a piece of paper. This isn't any different than handing somebody a brochure or a sales flyer. If you think that the resume is going to get you the job, you are dead wrong. The resume is nothing more than a sales brochure marketing you to get you to the next step. You've got, when a job goes out, especially in today's market, I had a friend of mine in New York who was looking for a research analyst who said to me, Mike, I put the ad in the paper. Within a week, I had 700 people apply. 700. What happens when you get 700? We start doing this. After you get somebody to take them all, somebody to open them all up and put them in a pile. You've got about less than 1.5 seconds for the display of your resume to catch the eye of the person just glancing over it before they're going to spend 3 to 5 seconds looking at it a little bit more to decide if they're going to put it aside to read it. Otherwise, it's doing this. And eventually what she said to me was, I wound up taking the top 10 because they were all qualified. 700. She required a minimum of a master's degree. That's how many educated people are out looking for jobs right now, too. So you need to come up with something to decide, how am I actually going to put together a resume so it's beautiful, flashy, shiny, clean, crisp, etc. It's a sales brochure. It's a marketing piece. Think like a marketing person. All right, the letter of application or the cover letter, the special circumstance of email applications, I think ought to be noted. What is the special circumstance of email applications? Think about this. Send email here. What's special about that? What's unique? What's different about that? If I send something in the mail, I've got a cover letter, I've got a resume. If I'm attaching something to an email, I'm attaching a cover letter, I'm attaching a resume. What other opportunity do I have? The subject line. The actual email name itself. Don't ever send something from Cutie Pie 106. Especially if you're a man looking for a welding job. You can have the cutesy names on your emails all you'd like, but don't use them for job hunting. Get a professional sounding name, even if it's just your first and last name at Hotmail, Yahoo, ABC.com, wherever. Get something that's professional and clean. You have an opportunity here in your signature, what we call the signature line that people put in their emails. What are you going to put there? Okay, kindest regards, Dr. Mike Searcy, and then, I might put a link to my LinkedIn profile, which if they're really interested, then they're going to go there and they're going to say, you're on LinkedIn, cool. And you've got all this other stuff put there. And sometimes on the LinkedIn profile, you have other people attesting to your skills. But you've got other little marketing opportunities right there. But the unique part that I was referring to that nobody's jumped up to scream at me about yet is, what about the email message itself? This is an opportunity that you actually have that goes above and beyond the cover letter. They're going to print the cover letter, and they're going to pass it on to the committee. But how do you actually set this up? Dear professional, dear hiring professional, you've got room right here now to actually say, my name is, I'm specifically sending this email to you with the following attachments because I'm looking to potentially apply for this position. Please accept these documents as of the partial package for my application. But now you also have an opportunity to actually say something like, I bring an awful lot of skill, knowledge, and expertise in the blank area to this, and I would very much welcome the opportunity to discuss it. You've got an opportunity here in the email message to show how eager, how excited, how enthusiastic, how interested you really are in the position. And to be personal. You were formal in the cover letter. Now's your opportunity to show that you have a personality. A clean personality. Okay, physical preparation. Page 8. Although there are contextual factors to the proper protocol at an interview, there are some important aspects to keep in mind because first impressions matter. So, Dr. Mike's top 10 interview tips to reflect and remember. Number 1, be on time. And in fact, years ago I used to work for McGraw-Hill selling college textbooks in 5 different states. When my manager used to call and say, I'm scheduling a meeting for 9 o'clock, you know what time he started that meeting? A lot of you are thinking, 9 o'clock. Absolutely not. When he said, I'm scheduling a meeting for 9 o'clock, that meeting started promptly at 8:45. Because he wanted it to get you into the habit of saying, you need to be here early. If you're not here earlier than every one of your appointments, for all the appointments that you're going out and meeting with various people, there's no point in you being at all. Because if you can't be recognized as being the one who's punctual, on time, professional, and showing up with all the right equipment, all the right preparation, then don't bother working for me. He must have been onto something because we were consistently number 1 in the district every time they ran the sales numbers. And he always used to say, if you plan all of your sales meetings and you were early for every one of them, just think of how many more you might be able to catch in, on the tail end of the day. We weren't always excited about that. Come commission check time, we were, though. Be on time. Number 2. Yes, it needs to be said. Turn your freaking cell phones off. If your cell phone goes off, rings in the middle of an interview, and you do the, oh, pardon me a moment. All right, first off, it's bad enough that it's Little Bo Peep playing on here. But even worse, if you actually turn away from the people you're hoping might actually employ you and want to take control of a bunch of your day, you're telling them at this point right now they're not important because, oh, you want to make lunch plans? Or what are you looking at on TV? Somebody called you to tell you a joke? Not good. Now, if you have a special needs situation, someone's getting ready to go into surgery, somebody's having a serious health crisis, that's another thing entirely, and you can tell somebody, I'm only going to answer this phone if it rings. If it's only from this specific number, it's on silent, and I just need to make that real clear to you because life and death is on the line. Life and death isn't on the line. There's no reason why you should ever have a cell phone in an interview. No reason whatsoever. Unless, of course, you're working for a cell phone company. Hygiene is important. Sometimes people look at me as if, you have to put this on here? Yes, I have to put this on here. I've given interviews, I've talked to people during interviews where they've come in completely tousled. They just rolled out of bed, threw a shirt on, pair of pants on, shut up in flip-flops. Hygiene's important. Make sure you're clean. Don't get in your suit or your dress and then go run 1.5 miles to the interview. You come in all sweaty, obviously there's a problem. How you dress is paramount to the impression you relay and how serious you are about the job. So number 1, avoid excessive jewelry. 2, avoid excessive perfume. We can overdo that. Cologne, perfume, etc. Avoid flamboyant clothes. Overly bright colors and things. You may not, you remember, of course, you don't know what the style is necessarily, the personal preference of the people you're talking to. You need to make sure that you're actually going to be conservative and look conservative. It's better to be overdressed than too casual. If you happen to be overdressed, so much overdressed to the person you're interviewing, and they take offense to that, do you really want to be working for that person anyway? Think about that. Go right back to, how am I going to be treated? Beware of your body language. Open and closed posture, right? We're not doing it, not necessarily doing a workshop today on nonverbal communication, but remember that you don't want to go in there like this. You sit down for an interview, you cross your legs and fold your arms over. What are you telling the interviewer? You might be actually thinking, boy, it's cold in here. But what might they interpret? If this person's not interested in this job, why are they even sitting in the room? Okay? Orient yourself to the people that you're talking to. Open gestures. And make it look like you want to be there. Because remember, even the most experienced professionals can get nervous during an interview. If you appear nervous, the interviewer might draw the wrong conclusions about your ability to do the job. They might think that you're trying to hide something. So try to appear calm. Breathe deeply. Okay? Maintain eye contact with your interviewer. When speaking, be polite and professional. Avoid using slang. Avoid using profanities. The more confident and polished you appear, the more likely you are to leave the interviewer with a positive impression. Be aware of your verbal language. Be aware of your verbal language. We don't want to swear. We don't want to use profanities. But, even more so, you've heard this theme from me before if you've come to any of my other workshops. One of the things that you need to think very hard about is phraseology. Phraseology. Don't use the word don't. And when I say don't, use the word don't, what am I really saying? The mind will actually process action far more quickly than it will process negation. The mind will process action far more quickly than it will process negation. Think about this for a moment. You've got a 5-year-old child who goes and gets a glass of milk, pours that glass of milk all the way to the rim of the glass, picks up that glass of milk. The child is walking into the living room to watch TV because the TV's on. You just put new carpeting down. You come in from the other side of the kitchen. You see the child going into the living room. And you immediately say, what? Don't spill the milk. The child immediately spills the milk. It goes all over the floor. Then you chide or otherwise punish the child for what the child thought you told the child to do. The mind will process action, spill the milk, far more quickly than it will process negation, don't. You want to work at the psychological, subconscious level of your interviewer? Start practicing to avoid the negatives in your conversation and speak in the positives. Don't say things like, well, I don't get nervous when I get up and give presentations. Say things like, I am confident when I do these things. I am confident I can do these things. And you will often tell, in many cases, you often leave a greater impression on the interviewer because you are paying attention to that phraseology. It's also going to help set your own frame of mind. Don't be nervous, don't be nervous, don't be nervous. We tell ourselves this again and again. And what are we programming ourselves to be?
Scared to death.
Scared to death, nervous. The mind will process action. Be nervous far more quickly than it will process negation. Don't. We need to be aware of our verbal language. Mental psycho. Action before negation. Keep your remarks positive. Avoid negative remarks about previous job responsibilities. You talk bad about the last couple of jobs. How can we expect you to have any positive comments about this one? Don't make jokes. You don't know the sense of humor of the person you're interviewing. Be very careful with that. And yes, I need to say this too. Don't flirt with the interviewer. It's really not going to be good in the long run. Pace your question responses. The last one I've got for you. Pace your question responses. What do I mean by this? Pace the question responses. Silence. Go back to the first part of this. Sometimes silence can speak volumes. Know when to speak, when not to speak. But here we're going to talk about how long shall I pause? And this takes practice depending upon the people you're talking to. And it changes from culture to culture to culture. Think about this for a moment. Research shows that if I ask you a question and you immediately come up with a response, very, very quickly, the interviewer is immediately going to think, rehearsed and prepared. Rehearsed and prepared. And yet, if I ask you a question and you pause thoughtfully and practice this, pause thoughtfully for a moment, then respond to the question, the interviewer will think, subconsciously or otherwise, they will recognize that you are giving their question the serious concern that it should be given because it was asked prior to your response. Even if you've got the answer that you're already going to use memorized. Practice pauses. But here's the catch. And this is where you need to practice it and ask people about your pauses. Because research also shows that if you pause just a slight second too long, the interviewers will commonly think, anything you're going to say after this moment, you're completely making up. You're scrambling for something to say, and it probably isn't going to be true. Which is also why I say practice your questions in advance. Practice your answers in advance. Dr. Mike's tip number 4. Practice thoughtful, reflective pauses. Bottom of page 8. Page 9, interview questions. Most interviews, let's put it this way, most interviews come with a pattern of questions that you're likely to see repeated again and again and again every time you go for a job interview. And here are some samples. The first one are the introductions. The interviewers will ask for introductory material. This is a place for you to shine. Prepare a statement ahead of time. Don't make it look like you prepared it and rehearsed it ahead of time. Prepare something ahead of time when somebody says, so tell us about yourself. If you're going to do the at that very question, we got problems, because what is the one topic you ought to be an expert in? Yourself. So when we say to you, so tell us about yourself, you better be able to have something. What is the most exciting thing or dependable thing? What do you want to portray? Dependability, stability, excitement, spontaneity, flexibility. This is an opportunity for you to actually kind of go right to your strength and talk about yourself in that light. Job expectations. The interviewers will want to find out if your expectations of a job are match the expectations of the organization in a newly hired employee. So they might ask you questions like, what motivates you the most in work? Or why did you decide to apply for the job? And if you want to answer, I applied for the job because it was open and you advertised it in the paper, don't get out of bed that morning. You're wasting your time. Have a real good response. And you've done your research. And by the time you get to the interview, you should have done the research on this company in various places already, online. What, have you been to their store or other locations that they're actually at, if they're open to the public? Have you talked to people who are already there? You should have some expectation of what's already there in that job, so that when you are able to talk to them, you can interview them, again, as much as they're interviewing you. Because if you've done your research, you are ahead of 95% of everyone else who's going to walk in that room. Academic background, preparation, and training. The interviewer will want to know if you have the proper education and or preparatory training that qualifies you for the job. The question might come across as something like, tell us something more about your education and courses. Page 10, knowledge of the organization. Here we go. All interviewers will be impressed if you know something about their organization. They want to assume that if you have taken interest enough in wanting the job, then you have taken initiative enough to research who and what it is you wish to work for. How many times have you walked into a job interview and they say, well, what do you know about our corporation? I know you're a store. And although you chuckle, and right now we can chuckle, I've been on many interview committees where that has been the case. They've walked in, they applied for the job truly because it was open, but once they were called for an interview, they still didn't do any further research in what they were getting themselves into. And so they figured, well, I'll learn about the position and I'll learn about the job. When I go to the interview, you're already behind the person who's going to get it. You're already behind the person who's going to get it. All right, and they're going to ask you questions like, what do you know about our company? Do you know someone working in the company? If you do, did you consult with them before the interview? They may ask you that question, but you should ask yourself that question. If ever I get an interview offer from any particular organization, do I know anybody there? Can I get in touch with anybody there? Can I talk to them? Work experience. Interviewers want to know what about your past experiences relate to the job for which you are currently applying. Are you thinking outside the box here? Relate club, hobby, extracurricular activity, these questions as well. We don't care, as an interviewer, we don't care what you did for another company. It doesn't mean a thing to me. I want you to take that a step further. You know what this job description is. I assume you've done your research and you've already talked to somebody at this company, or if you've researched as much about this company as you can, you've got a really good idea about what we do here. When I ask you about previous job experiences, I don't care what you did at another company. What I care about is, can you take those experiences at that other company and tell me how it fits here? If this is all a big human jigsaw, how do you fit? And how does what you did in the past relate to what we're going to expect you to do here? And if all you were, and I'm not saying that lightly, if all you were was a stay-at-home mother or father, does raising kids require organization? Hell yeah. And if that's the case, are you relating this organization to how you're going to fit in this company? What did you do here with raising the family that's going to help our company today? That's what we want to know. I don't care what your experience was here. I care how that matches here, how that fits here. How can you transfer those skills here? Does that make sense? So, those questions might come about as, can you tell me something about your working experience? What was the reason you left your last job and other previous occupations you had? What is the biggest problem you faced in your career so far? Don't talk about problems. That's a baited question. Talk about challenges. Talk about obstacles. And every time somebody asks you a question about problems, challenges, or obstacles, offer to talk about and discuss how you overcame those obstacles. Turn it positive. How do you cope with stress? What does an ideal boss, from your point of view, look like? How do you imagine a typical day in your work or our company? Would you mind working overtime? These are all questions they're going to ask you about your work experience and what you've done in the past, and have you approached these issues in the past? How do you solve conflicts with your colleagues, boss, or subordinates? What makes you feel sad in work? What makes you feel happy? Career goals. Most employers are interested in knowing what your short and long-term goals are, and especially how they might relate to the company or organization. Typically, short-term goals concern the next year or so, and long-term goals are life-oriented. And this is that question that people will often ask, where do you see yourself in 5 years? You should have already ascertained, is this a job that has had longevity in the past? Or is this a temporary job? So that you can certainly discuss If it's a temporary job, your interest in seeking long-term employment and potentially using this as a stepping stone. If this is a full-time, long-term job, the last thing you want to do is say, I'm looking for a job until I start college next, 6 months, or I move to Florida in a year. Because they want to know, does that match? When we talk about interviewing, we're talking about finding somebody who fits with our organizational culture and circumstances. That doesn't always happen. We know that. We don't always get out for jobs. All right. Again, to lighten the mood here, as the nervous job candidate is being asked, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And his response, where do I see myself in 5 years? He didn't prepare, did he? Probably in mirrors, pools of water, and other reflective surfaces. Yeah, I can see myself there, but we haven't actually talked about anything we're looking for. Strengths and weaknesses, page 11. Will hiring you enhance or hinder the overall organization? Both you and the employer are taking risks in this endeavor. It costs a company money to hire a person. It costs them money to train a person. And it certainly costs them money to lose a person. So if you aren't already familiar with the idea, understand right up front, it's a risk on both ends, the candidate as well as the organization. To this end, interviewers will often ask questions aimed at eliciting both what you see as your strengths as well as your weaknesses. Again, great cartoon here, right? As he's putting his foot up on the personnel person's desk. Nah, work-related stress isn't a problem. I've never taken a job seriously enough for it to bother me. That person pretty much ended their career there right now, didn't they? They're going to ask you the questions like, what are your main strengths related to this job? What are your main weaknesses as an employee? And of course, the same thing I said about problems. You talk about your weaknesses. What's your weakness? Renee's weakness is that she's over-dedicated. She puts far too much time in at work.
That's right.
Does it sound like a weakness? Sure, it sounds like a weakness. But to most interviewers, does it sound like somebody who's trying to express the fact that my weakness is I really want this job and I really want to work and I'm really going to put in what it takes? Of course it does. If you're going to talk about other weaknesses, make sure that it also comes across as something that is actually beneficial to a company. This is why we practice our questions and practice our answers in advance. Don't get caught off guard. No job interview should ever be something where you get caught off guard. It's kind of like an attorney. No attorney is going to go into court and ask a question he doesn't already know the answer to. Very rarely will you get asked a question you shouldn't already know the answer to if you've done your preparation. What do you consider as your biggest professional achievement in your life? Here's a chance for you to shine. How would you describe your relationship with your supervisor in your previous employment? This is not where you want to badmouth your employer. Not a good idea. Candidate questions. If you haven't got questions, copy these. If you haven't got questions, you better. Because the person who usually asks no questions usually tells us, ultimately, I'm just not interested in this job. I'm here for the ride. And it's been a great carnival ride, but it's over now. Thanks. Sample candidate questions on page 12. Is this a new expansion position or a replacement position? And what are you going to ask if they say it's a replacement position? They don't have to answer, but I'm always going to ask. And what happened to the person who had this position previously? We want to hear, oh, they're still here. They got promoted. Right? We want to hear that they're still here, they're still happy, and that there's expansion possibilities here for us, if that's what we're thinking. What is your time frame for filling this position? In other words, when can I expect to hear from you? Or when can I expect, when I don't hear from you, I'm just going to call this one dead and move on. What is the career growth potential? I'm familiar with the corporate culture, and only say that if you aren't, if you've done your research. But what does a regular day look like for this department, for this business, for this position? However we want to word that. How many people are on staff in the blank department? How many people am I working with? Do I have to remember a whole lot of names or just a few? Does the blank department work closely with any other internal departments? Who else are we working with as a group? What is the customer service philosophy of your company? And what is your favorite thing about working here? What is the customer service philosophy of your company? And this is something you've got to actually learn and understand that you're familiar with, because there are two primary customer service philosophies when we talk about dealing with customers, and every organization deals with customers of some kind. They may not be necessarily the paying kind. I'm selling you something directly, but service in some way is always part of every person's job. The customer service philosophy, number one, we've all heard this, right? The customer is always right, 100%. And so we're going to do absolutely positively everything there is to keep that one customer satisfied. That's one way of looking at it. And then if you look at it that way, those companies usually spend about 80% of their time with the 20% of their problem customers. And those are not usually the 20% that actually bring in the most business, the most service, the most calls, the most money, however we define success in this department. Or we might have a customer service philosophy that says, sometimes it's okay to sacrifice our most problematic customers for the sake of actually treating all of our other customers with higher quality service. Because let's face it, when I'm over here spending all my time with this person, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, I'm ignoring some other people who may just wander off. And that sometimes tends to be a problem. What's the customer service philosophy of this particular department, of this particular school, of this particular organization? And does it mesh with how I think activities ought to happen? And if it doesn't, do I really want to work here? Because it's only going to wind up hurting me later psychologically, and I'm not going to jive real well with it. You're going to get me in trouble. Or can I make it work for me? Dr. Mike's tip number 5. Again, I've said this once before. Remember to network, because if you're not networking, the chances are you are not working. I see an applicant being hired when they're giving a Rorschach test. At this point, keeping positive. All right, so what are we going to do here? Follow-up letter, page 13. To minimally complete the interview process, you should always, 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 always send a follow-up letter. Always include it in this format. It displays your continued interest. Thank you for, thank them. Display your continued interest. Helps keep your name in front of the employer's mind. Write them short and to the point. Include one to every person who you interview. Every one of them. Which means during an interview, make sure you're writing down all the names. Make sure you're keeping track of everyone. And if you haven't got everyone, and you didn't get it afterwards, there's no harm, no foul in calling the personnel department and asking them, can you tell me again the names of the people I actually interviewed? I'm trying to go over all this in my mind so that I can make sense of it, etc. You don't have to say, because I forgot them all, and I'm trying to get the thank you letters put together. I'm trying to make sense of who I was talking to specifically about what, and think about this a little bit more. Most human resource people are very happy to help you with that. So what should be the five-step format for follow-up letters? Thank the employer for the interview, number 1. State your interest in one or two specific aspects of the position or the company discussed in the interview. Make them remember that you know what you were talking about and that you understood what they're about. State your interest in one or two specific aspects of the position or the company discussed in the interview. Supply any additional information that was requested during the interview. Especially if you talked about something that you did, something you wrote, something that you created. Now's your opportunity to get it back in front of them. Number 4, express your continued interest in the position. Didn't we do that in number 2? You bet you did that in number 2. You're making it clear. And then finally, number 5, thank the employer for the interview. Did we do that in number 1? Of course we did that in number 1. It's a sandwich. And make it a happy. Okay. A note about social profiles, social media profiles. Interviewers will always now. It's not a maybe they will, maybe they won't. Somebody on any interview committee, I guarantee you, is always going to be Googling you and checking your Facebook, MySpace, LinkedIn, any of these other internet places that you may have a profile. Okay? You may have a lot of things on there that are objectionable. Even if it's just a picture of you holding a beer or a glass of something that is alcoholic, or may even look alcoholic. If they happen to be non-drinkers, or want to make some assumption that you might be one to overindulge, okay? If you're the kind of person to put up pictures that puts up, that where you're using your middle finger or making other gestures that are not too healthy, turn the profiles to private. During any kind of job interview process, when you're applying for anything, turn all your profiles to private. And never accept a friend request from anyone you are currently in the middle of applying for a job with. Because they're doing that on purpose, so they can dig around and see what they can find. So turn the profiles to private or clean them up. And it's very difficult to go back through sometimes years of things to clean up. So turn them to private unless you've purposely crafted a profile that you want them to see. And if that's the case, my suggestion to you is to go to LinkedIn. Any questions today? By coming to this session today, that qualifies you, but you need to get us your resume in advance, and Dorothy will put out an email to this effect. That qualifies you next week if you have an interest to coming in to do and practice mock interviews. We are going to actually get a number of people here to do mock interviews. You'll have an opportunity to practice mock interviews, as well as get some feedback from various evaluators who will look at those interviews and say, this is what we're seeing. This is something you might want to consider changing, doing. This is what you're doing great. This is what you're doing well, etc. But we'll want those resumes in advance so we can actually do our preparation specifically for your mock interview. So see Dorothy if you have questions about that. Any other questions? Then I thank you for your time.